I just want to make sure this thing is on. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Excellent. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out on this anniversary week here at Gettysburg. I'm John Hoptak, park ranger here at the Gettysburg National Military Park. I'm used to seeing so many of you out on the field, but just as good to see you all inside here. So I know we are all here today, everyone, to commemorate the anniversary of a significant event in our past in American history, but I simply could not let this opportunity pass without mentioning another. Of course, 250 years ago, this very day, delegates to the Second Continental Congress did what? Declared our independence, right? So July 2nd, a day that John Adams declared Americans would remember from here on out, was the day that the Congress voted to adopt the Richard Henry Lee resolution, which stated, quote, that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. So why not remember July 2nd the same way we do July 4th, right? Well, of course, 2 days later is when that same Congress voted to accept Jefferson's text of the Declaration of Independence. But an important date nonetheless, and again, I could not let this July 2nd pass without a mention of it. Fast forward 77 years, July 2nd, 1863, the fate of that country, very literally, was hanging on the balance right here in the open fields, rocky hilltops surrounding this small town in southern Pennsylvania, that town of Gettysburg, with this young country in the midst of this horrific Civil War, which was, Abraham Lincoln explained, a test to see whether or not that country, founded back in 1776, can long endure. And of course, it was a victory here at Gettysburg that helped ensure that it would. But what about that victory here? Who was responsible for that? Was it the Union soldiers, the Union generals perhaps? Maybe the terrain, perhaps the decisions of Confederate officers, right? Or perhaps a combination of the above. You know, history, there's a lot of argument, a lot of debate. Who was most responsible for the Union victory here at Gettysburg? Was it George Meade, the recently named commander of the Army of the Potomac, or perhaps his subordinates, right? His corps commanders who won this fight? Maybe Buford, maybe Reynolds, maybe Howard or Hancock, maybe Chamberlain or Sickles, right? But you know, you don't often hear in that argument, George Sykes. George Sykes, I would argue, remains the least known and most elusive of all the high-ranking Union generals here on this battlefield. Maybe some of you will agree, maybe not. I say elusive because it's hard to track him down in the history books. There's very little source materials pertaining to the commander of the 5th Army Corps, George Sykes, which is interesting because you can make the argument that 163 years ago this very day, it was his soldiers of the 5th Corps who saved the day for the Union, right? And emerging in the historical narrative from these fields of Gettysburg, you have such 5th Corps heroes as Chamberlain, Strong Vincent, Patrick O'Rourke, Harrison Jeffords. But again, you very seldom hear George Sykes, right? So what I hope to do this morning is paint a portrait, if you will, of General George Sykes, to try to rescue him just a little bit from those vast, vast halls of historical obscurity. So I'm not going to spend too much time today talking about the military ebb and flow of his actions here. Not going to talk much about the military achievements during the war, what they did on each battlefield, his soldiers. But I'm going to try to paint a portrait of the man and the soldier known as George Sykes. So I will try my very best. The source material is a bit scarce. You know, in the 60,000 books that have been written about this Civil War, I've yet to find one biography of George Sykes. So if anybody's looking to write something that has not yet been written on the war, George Sykes, right? All righty. So When you tour the battlefield, there's not much out there that lets you aware of Sykes' presence during the battle. Of course, we do have his 5th Corps headquarter marker down on the southern end of the battlefield, but that is a little bit overshadowed by the much larger equestrian monument of John Sedgwick that stands very nearby. So oftentimes, and I know you've heard this before, students of the Battle of Gettysburg, you know, Dan Sickles is the only Corps commander without a monument. Is that true? No, not one bit. We know that George Sykes does not have one, and you can make the argument that Alpheus Williams of the 12th Corps doesn't have one either here at Gettysburg. So we'll talk a little bit about monumentation at the end of our program here today. So, Sykes does appear a few places. The name of the tour road that cuts across Little Round Top is, of course, Sykes Avenue, probably the most visited spot on the battlefield, Little Round Top. But I would imagine many visitors kind of pass by that sign of Sykes Avenue on their way to locate where Joshua Chamberlain led that bayonet charge down the southern slopes of the hill. And of course, speaking of Jeff Daniels, and Joshua Chamberlain, I meant, Sykes does appear actually as a character in Michael Sharer's novel, The Killer Angels, but his speaking lines in the novel were taken over by Hancock in the film. So Sykes was kind of written out of the story when they made the movie Gettysburg back in 1993. So with that being said, who was George Sykes? The closest thing we have to a biography of General Sykes is this book written by Timothy Reese called Sykes' Regular Infantry Division, 1861 to 1864. So for those of you who know the book, you know that a good bit of material in here is about Sykes and regards him as a soldier. So Timothy Reese, the author of this book, wrote, he said that although revered as a solid, stubborn fighter by the soldiers who fought under him, Sykes never acquired the level of veneration accorded to others of his rank. He considered neither that expression of a personal opinion nor the liberal exercise of command was compatible with his duty, prompting contemporaries and historians alike to brand him with his West Point nickname, Tardy George. Discretion and reserve were mistaken, said Reese, for hesitation and dullness. So that is what Timothy Reese wrote about George Sykes, but what about his contemporaries? The ever-observant Frank Haskell of the Union Army headquarters staff wrote that from a personal point of view, Sykes was a small, rather thin man, well-dressed and gentlemanly, brown hair and beard, which he wears full, with a red, pinched, rough-looking skin, feeble blue eyes, large nose, with the general air of one who is weary and a little ill-natured. Do we know anyone like that? You know, I think on a hot day like today, we could describe a lot of folks as a bit weary and a little ill-natured, right? So that was from Frank Haskell, and as we're about to see, the soldiers in the Army, the United States Army, who served with Sykes in a professional capacity, nothing but praise for the man. George Cullum, in his history of West Point officers, wrote that Sykes was a model soldier, always at his post and ever ready, faithfully and promptly to perform every duty entrusted to him. He was a strict disciplinarian, but one who asked nothing of his men that he was not willing to endure himself. He looked upon his profession as one in which honor was to be achieved only by hard, conscientious work. Dangerfield Parker, who served under Sykes in the 3rd United States Infantry before the war, he echoed this sentiment when he wrote that Sykes was, quote, an officer for whom I have always had an ardent admiration. He was a born soldier and displayed conspicuous ability in every position in which he was placed. He was upright and chivalrous. As a companion, he was courteous, and to his friends, he was genial. And rounding out this high praise was Patrick Breen, an Irish immigrant who served under Sykes throughout much of the Civil War. He wrote, quote, no braver officer unsheathed his sword in the war for the Union Chivalrous, valiant, and enthusiastic on all occasions was patriotic George Sykes, always on the keen lookout for the welfare of his men both in camp and on the march, but a strict disciplinarian in all things military. Most of these quotes, most of these observations were by those who served in the regular United States Army. For a brief time during the war, Sykes did command volunteers. So what did the volunteer soldier have to say about Sykes? It's a little bit different. To the volunteer, perhaps he was a little bit too detached, maybe a bit too cold, maybe a bit too strict. Francis Donaldson, who served in the 118th Pennsylvania, left this, I guess you could say, mixed review. He said that Sykes is a martinet, a severe, unkindly man to all save the regulars. Himself a West Point graduate, a thorough soldier, brave and accomplished, in whom the men have a great confidence, fear, and respect. But yet he spoils all of this by his undisguised contempt and hatred for the volunteers. This the men know, so there is no sympathy between him and them. He never speaks to an enlisted volunteer, and on the march he always halts among the regular troops. Yet for all this, we are proud of our commander. He looks to our wants and handles us with skill and ability. And I think this is the most important part of this. He says, we consider General Sykes to be a great man of the Army, but his manner being against him, he will never make a name for himself. So is that perhaps why we know so little about Sykes? His manner being against him? Perhaps. Why do we know so little about Sykes? I think a few reasons. As Donaldson noted, he never really did make a great name for himself because, well, he didn't really promote himself too much. He was very content to let his record speak for itself. He was not a McClellan. He was not a Pleasanton. He was not a Sickles. He didn't try to curry favor with reporters. He didn't try to promote himself too much in the press. He was ambitious, okay, just like most all the Union officers or Civil War officers, but he never really had a strong connection to a major politician, to a major newspaper outlet. And as far as I know, a diary hasn't emerged. Memoirs, no reminiscence, and very little written record thus far. So if you are thinking about writing a biography of him, I think you're going to have to dig deep, looking for those sources. He also tried to stay a little bit clear and above the infighting, the bickering, the back and forth fighting amongst the officers of the Union Army of Potomac throughout the war. He did not try to ruffle feathers. He did his job, and that was what he thought would be recognized. That was what he thought would be rewarded. And I think another reason, too, is because for most of his service in the Civil War, he was associated with the regulars, the United States Army regulars, and not a volunteer organization. So, of course, most of this war were fought by volunteer regiments. The war's over, they're discharged, they go home. They established strong volunteer veteran organizations. They wrote regimental histories. They dedicated monuments in town squares. The regulars, by and large, did not do this. This was their profession. This was their career. So much like Sykes, they fought the war, and then as the war ended, they went on to other assignments, other duties. And you don't really have that strong veterans connection amongst the United States regulars as you did volunteer organizations throughout the war. And another reason why we know so little, well, there has not yet been that biography written. Somewhere out here. Yeah, or perhaps online, we have a biography in the making. If there was a biography, though, of George Sykes, it would probably begin in October of 1822, when he was born in Dover, Delaware, into a very prominent Delaware family. His great-grandfather was a lawyer and himself a delegate to the Continental Congress in 1777. So his forebears were among the political leaders of early Delaware history. His grandfather was a physician who became one of the best-known surgeons in the state of Delaware. He served for a time as president of the Delaware Medical Society, and for a brief time, 1801 to 1802, Sykes's grandfather served as an interim from governor as a member of the Federalist Party. But despite that strong, prominent name in Delaware, we don't know very much about young George Sykes. We do know that he was only 15 years old when he set off for West Point. So he received a commission to West Point in the summer of 1838, so he was still 15, not quite 16, when he arrived at the United States Military Academy. And from some records, it seems he struggled academically while there. His classmates, and we'll talk about some of them in just a moment, they were struck a little bit by how quiet, how reserved Sykes seemed to be, even as a young man. And as Timothy Reese points out in his book, the nickname that we most associate with Sykes, Tardy George, was acquired at West Point and not during the Civil War itself. So it was not a reflection of his battlefield performance during the conflict here. Even at West Point, apparently, he was known as Tardy George. And he graduated near the bottom of his class. He was ranked 39th out of a class of 56 graduates in an illustrious class, the class of 1842. So I want to test your knowledge here. Let's see here. How many we can name from amongst this list. So call them out as I point to them. What about here? Yeah, James Longstreet graduated 54th that year. Okay, so 54th out of 56. Please don't tell my colleague, Ranger Carlton Smith. But Longstreet, of course, graduated near the bottom of that illustrious class. How about here? Lafayette McLaws, of course, one of Longstreet's divisional commanders. And next to him, Richard Anderson, of course, one of A.P. Hill's divisional commanders here at the Battle of Gettysburg. To the left of Anderson, anyone know? Daniel Harvey Hill. So D.H. Hill was not present here at the Battle of Gettysburg, but D.H. Hill and Sykes were roommates. And if we were to go to West Point during this time, that probably had to be the place to be, right? The room where Sykes and D.H. Hill were rooming together. I don't know about that. Of course, above there we have Abner Doubleday, right? And John Pope. John Pope, commander of the Army of Virginia. Next to him is A.P. Stewart, who was a prominent Confederate general in the Western Theater. And what about up here? Speaking of the Western Theater, Rosecrans, right? And right next to Rosecrans, looks like Thomas. That's actually John Newton. John Newton took command of the 1st Army Corps here at Gettysburg after Meade arrived on the field and kind of kicked Doubleday out. So John Newton, a very prominent engineer among that class, and he was present. He did play a role in this battle, of course. But, boy, the winner, if anyone could name this one, graduated first that year in the class of 1842. Doesn't look... I hear it. Who said it? Henry Eustis is absolutely right. So Henry Eustis from Massachusetts graduated first that year, and he was present on the battlefield. He commanded a brigade in the Army's 6th Corps, and I think near the Sykes Monument, you'll see some monuments to Eustis's brigade. So Henry Eustis, a brigade commander, was first in his class that year. George Sykes graduated 39th. Longstreet was 17 places underneath that, right? 15 places. Upon his graduation, Sykes becomes a 2nd lieutenant in the 3rd United States Infantry, and that is the start of a decades-long career in the United States Army. So as a 2nd lieutenant, he is sent off to Florida. He is involved in some combat in the Second Seminole War, and then he is sent to Mexico. And like many future Civil War notables, he does establish himself as a tough, hard-fighting officer, commissioned officer during that conflict. He is cited for gallantry at the Battle of Cerro Gordo in April of 1847, and he came to the attention of those who served above him in rank. One said that Sykes was always ready for anything that was proposed. He was simple-hearted, honest, and eminently true. A first-rate duty man, generous and considerate of others, and modest to a fault. Modest to a fault, right? Perhaps another reason why we don't hear much about George Sykes. During this time, in the 1840s and the early 1850s, Captain Thomas Anderson served alongside Sykes. His uncle, by the way, was Robert Anderson, who later was in charge of Fort Sumter. But Thomas Anderson wrote of Sykes, "It would have been hard to find a better officer in the Army than Sykes. He was so thoroughly and simply a soldier that he knew little of politics and cared less. He was unsympathetic and methodical, a man of detail, diligent and untiring, but never hurried, never flurried, one of the coolest men in danger or confusion that we have in the whole Army. He enforced discipline like a machine and had no more sentiment than a gun stock." I don't know if he was trying to be a compliment there. I don't know, maybe Gunstock Sykes would be a good nickname, right? In 1855, Gunstock Sykes is promoted to the rank of captain, and he held that rank for the next 6 years when, of course, Civil War broke out in the spring of 1861. So as the calendar turned to that fateful year, George Sykes, now a captain, was stationed at Fort Clark, Texas, which is way out here. Fort Clark, he had about 300 men under his command, and Texas seceded from the Union on February 1st of 1862. Sykes received orders a few weeks later to get himself and his 300 men out of the state. So he had a rather long march. He had to get his way all the way to the Gulf Coast. Over here where you see this star. So he embarked upon this march on March 9th of 1861. 300 miles lay ahead. He had orders to get his command out of Texas, and he was on his way to the coast to do just that. And he had issued very strict orders to his men along this route. Do not take from the civilians, do not steal their livestock. But along the way, it came to his attention that 4 of his soldiers were carrying a dead hog that they had taken from a resident of Texas. Well, what did Sykes do? Well, he had the animal cut in 4, and each of the offending soldiers had to wear a necklace with part of the pig around their neck. These were to be worn day and night, these necklaces, until further orders, said Sykes. Another man said that about the middle of the second day, under the influence of the warm sun, the effect of this treatment began to make itself manifest. Such odors swept back over the train and the column as we had never inhaled before. Everyone forswore pork and cursed Sykes's devilish ingenuity. Toward evening, it became unbearable, and a deputation waited upon Sykes and begged him, by everything he held sacred, to give us a rest. The pork was buried, the air became pure again, but there was no more hog stealing. So that was Sykes's method of dealing with those offenders. It took about a month, but Sykes and his command arrived on the coast on April 12th of 1861. Does that date sound familiar? Of course, several hundred miles away, as Sykes and his men are boarding a steamer, the steamer heading the Empire City. They are sailing away from Texas while the first shots of this war are ringing out at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. And they got out just in time, because after Fort Sumter surrendered, Confederate authorities deemed that all U.S. soldiers in Texas were now prisoners of war. And in Texas still, there were about 13 companies of U.S. soldiers who became prisoners after the outset of war. But Sykes and his men had gotten out just in time. They stopped to take on coal in Havana, Cuba, and that is where Sykes learned of the war breaking out. The steamer that he was on with his men made their way to New York City. Thousands of volunteers are being organized in the streets of New York. The next assignment, Washington, D.C. Sykes arrives on May 10th and found himself a major. So he is promoted to the rank of major, and he is given command of a battalion of regulars, a few hundred U.S. Army soldiers, the career soldiers, not the volunteers, but the regulars that Sykes would take to the field in that first battle of Bull Run. So Sykes does play a role in the first major land battle of the war. He had command of a few hundred men of U.S. regulars, and they are in support of a massive flank attack that will eventually wear down the Confederate lines on Matthews Hill. So he is in support, advancing behind the regulars, a steadying influence on these volunteer soldiers in front of him, including from Rhode Island. And the Rhode Island contingent was commanded by Ambrose Burnside. And Burnside at one point said, "We need help. We need to get some support to drive these Confederates to our front." And that's when Sykes arrived on the field. One man wrote that Sykes made a short speech. He cautioned us to keep from getting excited, to fire low. He told us that we were regulars and we were regarded as the mainstay of the brigade. He called his officers about him and told them that he had every confidence in them, although most of us had never before seen battle action. So Sykes knew that the volunteers will be looking at the regulars for an example. And as they're approaching Burnside's line, Burnside apparently grew very demonstrative. "Good God, Sykes, you're exactly who we need here." And apparently he was a bit too excited, because Sykes turned to one of his men and said, "Just ignore him, that man is crazy." But Sykes and his men do arrive on the scene, and they do help to push the Confederate soldiers off Matthews Hill back to Henry Hill. But that afternoon, the fortunes of battle changed. Confederate counterattacks would eventually drive the Union forces from the field, and Irvin McDowell, the commander of the Union troops on the field that day, he called upon Sykes and his regular to help stem the Confederate tide, to help cover the retreat of the Union Army across the Bull Run. "All was lost," said Dangerfield Parker. We met him before. "The whole field, as far as the eye could see, was covered with panic-stricken and flying men." Sykes's regulars delivered a few volleys, but pretty soon Confederate cavalry comes galloping onto the field. And in the face of that, Sykes is going to order his battalion to form squares on the field of Manassas there, and apparently his actions even caught the attention of Confederate Commanding General Pierre Beauregard, who wrote that Sykes's defiant stand described as a small but incomparable body of regular infantry. But it wasn't long before the numbers wore out and the Confederate Army was able to sweep all what was left of the Union Army from the field. Sykes and his men were among the last to cross the Bull Run that day. He lost about 83 men killed and a few hundred wounded and captured. His actions did grab attention. His divisional commander wrote that Sykes displayed discipline, steadiness, and heroic fortitude. Now, it was a disaster for the United States, that first battle of Bull Run. Up next, Sykes and his men returned to Washington. They went into camp at Arlington Heights, and a few days later, President Lincoln stopped by. Irvin McDowell introduced Lincoln to Sykes, telling him that this was the man who saved the Army at Bull Run. Now, there's a new commander in town. McDowell has been replaced by McClellan, right? So George McClellan has been called into Washington. He takes command of what he would soon rename the Army of the Potomac. And McClellan really wants the regulars, these career soldiers, to form the nucleus of this new army. He wants the volunteers to look at the regulars as the example. And to command the regulars, McClellan has complete faith, complete trust, complete confidence in 39-year-old George Sykes. So Sykes is given command of the regulars, again, what McClellan was hoping to be the nucleus of this army, and George Sykes was in command of it. And the size of Sykes's command would grow throughout the winter of 1861 into 1862. President Lincoln authorized the recruitment of several more regiments of regulars for the United States Army, and they all went to Sykes. So that by the outset of the Peninsula campaign, Sykes had about a division, 2 brigades of U.S. regulars under his command. And along with that came a promotion. So he was a major at First Bull Run. Now he's a brigadier general. Interestingly, though, he's a brigadier general of volunteers, even though he commanded regulars. In the regular U.S. Army, he would hold the rank of major almost throughout the entire war. His elevation in command was as a volunteer general. Now, I don't have time to explain all of his various battle actions throughout the following 15 months as he commanded his regular division. I do want to mention a few things briefly about some of the fights where he and his men were notable. Up first, Gaines Mill. During the 7 Days campaign outside of Richmond, it was the first severe test of combat for Sykes's division. And there, his men found themselves holding the right flank of the 5th Corps line that day. The 5th Corps, isolated from the rest of the Union Army, they were told to hold out as long as possible while McClellan withdrew the rest of the army further south to a point closer toward the James River. And several times, Sykes's men were able to turn back repeated attacks from A.P. Hill, but later in the evening, D.H. Hill arrives back on the scene. And we remember D.H. Hill from those days at West Point. He was Sykes's roommate at the military academy all those years before, now a Confederate divisional commander. When Harvey Hill wrote about this attack after the war, he said that, quote, "One of the saddest things connected with the miserable fratricidal war was the breaking of ties of friendship and of blood. The troops opposing mine on that murderous field that day were regulars under George Sykes, a Southerner by birth, Delaware, and my roommate at West Point, a man admired by all for his honor, courage, and frankness, and particularly endeared to me by his social qualities." D.H. Hill didn't praise a lot of people. So the fact that he praised Sykes, I think, speaks a lot about Sykes as a soldier and a man. Now, at long last, Sykes and his men were driven from the field along with the rest of that 5th Corps. One observer noted that Sykes's men had held that day like an iron wall. How about that for a nickname? No more gunstock Sykes. What about Iron Wall Sykes? It worked for Stonewall, right? Iron Wall. I don't think that'll take. Following the 7 Days battles, Sykes and his regulars next found themselves in a familiar place, performing a familiar role. On the battlefields of Manassas, that second day of the fight, August 30th, James Longstreet, again another of Sykes's roommates at the academy, will unleash a powerful flank attack against the 5th Corps, holding now the left end of the Union line. And holding that untenable position was Sykes's 3rd Brigade. So in Sykes's division, he had 2 brigades of regulars, 1 small brigade of volunteers, the 5th and 10th New York Infantry, under the command of Colonel Gouverneur K. Warren. At 2nd Manassas, these 2 regiments totaled 490 men in the 5th New York. 320 became casualties that day, including 117 men killed, the largest number of men killed in any regiment in any battle of the war. These were Sykes's volunteers. Now, while Warren's brigade was getting hammered on the left of the Union line, his 2 brigades of regulars fell back slowly, methodically, under a murderous storm of shot and of shell, retiring first to Henry House Hill, where they were called upon by John Pope to help cover the retreat of the army. So it's what they did in July of 1861. They're doing the same thing now in August of 1862. He performed credibly, helped get the army extracted from their position, but not a lot of glory goes to those who helped cover a retreat. But Sykes was called in that day. Now, at Antietam, Sykes and his regulars hold the middle of the Union Army. They're held largely in reserve. At Fredericksburg, they're held in reserve one more time, but one more time they help cover the retreat of the army, this time across the Rappahannock in December of 1862. There was an opportunity for Sykes for a little bit of glory at a battle called Chancellorsville in May of 1863. Sykes and his division of regulars were leading the way after Joe Hooker had gotten the Army of the Potomac behind Robert E. Lee's army. On May 1st, Sykes's men became engaged in a firefight, again with another one of his roommates, this time under Lafayette McLaws. just near Chancellorsville, Virginia. And they seem to have been driving the Confederate Army back. It seemed that Hooker had indeed stolen a march on Lee and gotten behind the Confederate Army, but at this very moment, when Sykes was calling for support, was calling for reinforcement, instead he got orders to fall back, to retreat. The men were full of fight and moved with alacrity, but alas, we were ordered back. Then there was heard cursing and grumbling from the regulars, not at being ordered into danger, but at being ordered out. All knew too well again that somebody had blundered. And that somebody was Joseph Hooker. At least they believed so. Hooker, who had stolen this march on Lee, had gotten his army in position behind Lee, balked and pulled his men back, handing the initiative over to Lee and to Stonewall Jackson. They all too willingly picked up that initiative and attacked the following day, driving the Union Army back with heavy, heavy loss. Throughout it all, Sykes was, quote, stern and eagle-eyed, changing not a muscle in his face. Now, following the victory at Chancellorsville, Robert E. Lee set his army in motion. On another campaign, an invasion north, this time further into Union soil than ever before, a campaign that culminated 163 years ago yesterday right here at Gettysburg. And Joe Hooker leads the Union Army north in pursuit as Lee's army made their way down the Shenandoah into Pennsylvania. But by June 28th, right here at Frederick, Maryland, Lincoln has lost patience with Hooker, and he replaces him with George Meade. George Meade, commander of the 5th Army Corps, was not asked to take command, he was told to take command. And after Meade's elevation to Army command of the 5th Corps fell to the highest ranking general in that organization. And that was George Sykes. So much is made here at Gettysburg that Meade had only been in command of his army for a few days before the battle. That is true. The same could be said for Sykes. He was only in command of the 5th Corps for a few days before he brought that corps onto the field here at Gettysburg 163 years ago today, this morning. So Sykes will take command of the 5th Corps, marching north first toward Hanover. They arrived there on July 1st, but then orders arrived to make their way toward a town called Gettysburg. The 5th Army Corps, with Sykes in the lead, approached Gettysburg from the east, and they arrived to within a few miles of town overnight, July 1st into July 2nd. When they arrive, Sykes is going to dispatch a courier to Meade, letting him know that he's still a few miles away. That courier is intercepted by Confederate troops and kind of helped convince Ewell and Confederate generals not to pursue attacking Culp's Hill for fear that there's a large Union force just off to the east, a few miles away. So I think inadvertently George Sykes had an impact on the outcome of that first day of the battle. Much of July 2nd, much of today, 163 years ago, was quiet. Of course, the main battle action on July 2nd doesn't begin till about 3:30 in the afternoon. So most of that hot Thursday, maybe not quite as hot as today, but still hot Thursday, the Union Army was getting into position. The Confederate Army was getting into position to attack. So George Meade, at about 3 p.m., summons all his corps commanders to his headquarters at the home of Lydia Leicester. And it was at that fateful meeting that Thursday afternoon, just about 3 o'clock, that Meade discovered something. His army was not quite in the position he thought it would be. How come? Sickles, right? Dan Sickles was spending much of that morning concerned, worried about his line, his position. Is this where Meade wants me to go? There's a better ground to be had there. So Sickles will spend most of that morning repositioning his 3rd Corps, and Meade is unaware of what's happening just about 1.5 miles south of his headquarters. He doesn't find out until later on, and it was just at that moment that the Confederate Army was about to strike. So Meade will spring into action for the first time since he took command. He is exercising field army command here at Gettysburg. He wasn't here on the first day of this battle, but now all of a sudden, that Thursday afternoon, Meade becomes Army commander in the moment of crisis. And fortunately for him and for the Union, he had summoned this meeting of his corps commanders because his top-ranking subordinates were literally right in front of him. So he gives the order to Hancock to send at least one division south to support Sykes. He turns to Henry Slocum, commanding the 12th Corps, and says, get your men off of Culp's Hill and take them south to relieve Sykes. And Slocum calls a timeout. Do you want me to abandon Culp's Hill entirely? Yes, the danger's to our left. Let me keep at least one brigade up there. Fine. That brigade Dan Welch just talked about, Greene's brigade, of course, left behind on Culp's Hill. The rest of the Union Army is making its way south because of what Sykes had done. And George Sykes was there. And Meade will turn to George Sykes, and he will order Sykes to take his 5th Corps from reserve and hold the key to the battlefield. As Sykes later wrote, the key to the battlefield was entrusted to my command. What was that key? Well, it could have been Little Round Top. It could have been the left flank of the Union Army. But in this painting by Dale Gallen that represents this chaotic moment at Union Army headquarters that Thursday afternoon, you can see Gouverneur Warren here saddling up. He had been instructed by Meade to make his way to that rocky hilltop yonder, Little Round Top, and attend to matters there. Here we see Hancock getting his orders to take at least one division south, and back here, making an appearance, is General Sykes. So there he is. We can spot him. George Sykes will begin to lead his 5th Corps south, about 11 to 12,000 men. Now, what do I mean to say when I said it was fortunate for Meade and for the Union that he had called this meeting? Because as we're about to find out, the lead elements of the 5th Corps begin to arrive on Little Round Top just minutes before Alabama and Texas troops got there. Those minutes could have been all the time it took to send an order via horseback courier, then delivering it in person, right? So much of history sometimes could hinge on these very small events. So Sykes is on his way south with his 3 divisions. His 1st division, commanded by Charles Griffin, mostly, but here at Gettysburg, under James Barnes. In Barnes's command is that famous 1,300-man brigade commanded by Strong Vincent, making their way up to Little Round Top to hold that critical ground just minutes before the Confederate Army struck. Also making their way south, Roman Ayers and his division of regulars. This was Sykes' division just a few days earlier, now commanded by Ayers here on the field. And finally, the 3rd Division under Samuel Crawford, Pennsylvania Reserves mainly, heading south, all making their way to plug this gap in the Union line, created when Sykes moved forward. Now, Sykes himself is hard to pinpoint in all the records about Gettysburg. Where was Sykes physically during all of this? Well, it seems like he is riding in advance of his men. He intercepted one of Gouverneur Warren's couriers off a Little Round Top and told him to report to Barnes to get a brigade to Little Round Top. Sykes will then gallop into the wheat field where he spoke with David Birney, one of Sykes' divisional commanders, and told Birney to focus on Devil's Den. He's going to put 2 other of Barnes's brigades on Stony Hill in the wheat field. At that point, it seems that Sykes turns around, makes his way back toward near his 5th Corps marker today, and then to the northern shoulder of Little Round Top. From that elevated point, near where Gibbs's battery would later go, Sykes is watching as Ayers will lead his regulars, his beloved regulars, into the wheat field where they are just crushed by a massive Confederate attack. William Wofford's men that afternoon. Minutes later, Crawford arrives on the scene, and under Sykes' personal view, Crawford is going to sweep down that northern slope of Little Round Top and push back that Confederate assault toward the northern end of that hill. One of the 5th Corps soldiers who were there that day, he wrote this. Lieutenant Colonel David Jenkins of the 146th New York, "I have often thought that I would give anything for an oil painting by a good artist of that scene, which I shall never forget as long as my life lasts. There was that high bluff covered with rocky crags, and upon which our brave Zouaves, the 146, were dispersed. in every possible position. On the central rock was the signal flag telling the story of the battle, and there was Warren, the mastermind, it seemed, with his neck patched up from a wound he had received. There was Hazlitt and Weed dying, and Sykes and Girard as cool as if witnessing a review, while those rifled guns of Hazlitt were within 15 yards of the same place and firing directly over their heads. That's one of the few accounts of Sykes on the field that day. And in the intervening years, in the past 163 years, when the history was written about this battle, Sykes seems to have been written out. Instead, who emerges from the 5th Corps as the heroes of that second day? Strong Vincent, Joshua Chamberlain, Patrick O'Rourke, Charles Hazlitt, Stephen Weed. Sykes himself is kind of overlooked. Some historians would say there's a good reason for that. He very clearly was in over his head. His divisions were not properly placed. They were parceled out piecemeal here and there without any real coordination. Others would say he responded well to the emergency and sent troops to where they were most needed when they were most needed. Sykes later concluded in his official report, "Night closed the fight on July 2nd. The key of the battlefield was in our possession intact. Vincent, Weed, and Hazlitt, chiefs lamented throughout the whole Corps and Army, sealed with their lives the spot entrusted to our keeping and on which so much depended. I am happy to say the 5th Corps sustained its reputation. An important duty was confined to it, which was faithfully and gallantly performed." Now, following the fight here at Gettysburg, Sykes would retain command of his 5th Corps. And this photo, I believe, was taken in August or September of 1863. It's almost a high top rank of the Union Army of the Potomac. We have Gouverneur Warren over here, Chief Engineer William French, who took command of the 3rd Army Corps following Sickles and Birney, Henry Hunt, the Chief of Artillery, Andrew Atkinson Humphreys, 2nd Corps, later became Meade's Chief of Staff. We have Sykes over here making another appearance, right? In the middle is Meade, looking as pleasant as always. So, I'm only kidding. Looks like he didn't want to get that photo taken. So Sykes is going to retain command of the 5th Corps throughout the fall of 1863 and into the spring of 1864. All seemed to be going well. There was no major issue with his command, with his corps or anything like that, but everyone, including him, they were stunned. In March of 1864, when he suddenly lost his job. In March of 1864, he's relieved of command of the 5th Army Corps. So what had happened? Well, Abraham Lincoln, facing re-election, is going to bring Ulysses Grant east to become General-in-Chief of all the Union armies. And Grant is going to take to the field with this particular army, the Army of the Potomac, still under the command of Meade. But that army, it needed some structural changes. Already the 11th Corps, the 12th Corps, had been detached and sent south. The 1st and 3rd Corps never recovered from their casualties here, and those soldiers are incorporated into the other 3. The 2nd Corps, Hancock, the 5th Corps, Sykes, the 6th Corps under Sedgwick. But then, after the army was restructured, Sykes will learn that he's going to be replaced by Gouverneur Warren. The hero of Little Round Top here, the chief engineer of the army, will now be given command of the 5th Corps. And Sykes was a bit stunned and I think hurt by this. George Meade knew it was coming. George Meade was summoned to the War Department in February of 1864. Stanton, the Secretary of War, told Meade that Pleasanton, his chief of cavalry, is going, that John Newton is going, and Sykes. And Meade seemed to have, argued a little bit to retain Sykes, but in the end, the army won out, and Sykes found himself relieved of command. He wrote a farewell address to his 5th Corps, and he wrote, "By direction of the War Department, I am relieved from duty with the Army of the Potomac. In obeying an order so wholly unexpected, I part with you with the most profound regret. We have shared all the campaigns of this glorious army, and for 9 months it has been my pride and distinction to be your chief. The history of your achievements adds a luster to the history of your country, and in the great battles of the war, on the July 2nd, your heroism and valor indisputably saved the day at Gettysburg. I part from you feeling assured that your manly virtues, courage, and patriotism will still be conspicuous in campaigns yet to come, and that the insignia borne upon your flags and worn upon your breasts will, in the shock of battle, always be found in the thick of your country's foes. So a heartfelt goodbye by George Sykes. His next command, he's being reassigned to the Department of Kansas. I'll get to that in just a moment. So why was Sykes relieved? Some may have argued that he was a bit too cautious. I'm not sure about that. I think some historians will link his nickname with battlefield performance. Maybe it was his association with McClellan and Porter, that whole Fifth Corps. Of course, it might have taken longer for it to catch up with Sykes. I don't know. Poor health may have been a factor. He was not well physically. He had been in the field, been in the Army now for several decades, taking little time for himself. In fact, Timothy Reese would write that it was largely his poor health that would prompt this change in command. Perhaps. So Sykes found his way to Kansas, to a backwater post, the District of Kansas, and he remained there for the duration of the war. It doesn't really appear much in the historical record after that, but in March of 1865, as this war was winding to a close, Sykes is breveted a brigadier general and a major general in the regular army for his actions at Gettysburg and throughout the war. That was just a brevet, and it was as a volunteer. When the war ends, Sykes reverts back to his rank as lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. And he is given command of a number of frontier posts in Minnesota, New Mexico, Texas. And as the years passed, he learned that so many of his peers, so many of his subordinates are being promoted over him, one after the next. And he still had that command, lieutenant colonel, after nearly 40 years in the Army. He learned in the late 1860s that he was being considered for a brevet or honorary promotion to colonel, and he said he didn't want it. He said, if my service does not entitle me to the same preferment as that conferred upon my equals in rank, upon those who have served under me, and upon some who have never been in the field, I do not desire any brevet promotion. But finally, in 1878, he does attain the rank of full colonel, and he is given command of the 20th U.S. Infantry in Fort Brown, Texas. Sadly, he passed away a short time later. George Sykes died at the age of 57 on February 8th of 1880. Tim Reese wrote, cancer had engulfed, quote, the left side of his face, doubtless the result of too many years' service in the boiling western sun. And the remains of George Sykes were laid to rest in Fort Brown in Texas. And since then, I think even before then, Sykes has slipped from our public memory. His death was certainly lamented by those who knew him. George McClellan, when he learned about Sykes' death, he wrote that, quote, as a gentleman, his character was the highest, also the purest, and he endeared himself to all who were so fortunate to be associated with him. As a soldier, his record was one that we all might be too glad to possess. Decades passed, monuments began to appear here at Gettysburg and on other fields of this war. One by one, the Union general's highest ranking officers are getting equestrians or bronze statues out on the battlefield. Everyone but Sykes, it seemed. But there was an effort. In 1890, in a letter to John Nicholson, heading up the Gettysburg Commission, John Batchelder, the park's first historian, wrote, quote, I have secured 70,000 pounds of bronze with which to make equestrian statues of Meade, Hancock, Sykes, Sedgwick, and Warren. Some of those materialized, others did not. A few years later, it's 1898, And as reported in the Gettysburg Compiler, Representative Howard Hanson of Maryland put forward a bill in the Maryland State House looking for $25,000 to pay tribute to Sykes to General John Sykes. His name was George. The following year, another bill, this time in the state of Delaware, $25,000 to honor their native son who was killed leading his division at the Battle of Gettysburg. So according to these newspaper accounts, one got the name wrong, the other believed he had lost his life here. I think that explains a lot about why we know so little about George Sykes. There is a monument, though. There is a monument to Sykes, and I'm going to end with that. In 1880, the junior senator from Rhode Island, Ambrose Burnside, will ask Congress for $1,000 to retrieve the remains of George Sykes from Fort Brown, Texas, and to help cover the costs of his removal to West Point. And then an effort was made to place a fitting memorial, a tombstone. So money was sought, donations were asked for, and you can see there those who donated to this undertaking. Sherman, Porter, Doubleday, Slocum, Patrick, all these very recognizable names, all contributed some money to the monument you see on the right that stands over the grave of George Sykes in the West Point National Cemetery. He's buried very near to Alonzo Cushing, to John Buford, to Judson Kilpatrick, right there. And on top, although you can't see it quite in that image, 3 words, the motto of West Point, that I think aptly describes Sykes: duty, honor, courage. Thank you all so much for attending this lecture.